Alright, so I got an absolutely wild story here for you guys on our boy Meatball Ron, who probably has presidential ambitions in the near future, which is absolutely alarming for a number of different reasons, but especially with the reporting that we are going to be getting into here from Harper's Magazine. So they titled this piece, See No Evil. This is actually based on a podcast discussion and interview that was done with Mike Preisner, who's a very well-known, well-respected anti-imperialist advocate, also was formerly in the military himself and saw firsthand how absolutely brutal our war machine in the United States can be. And he was having a conversation with Mansour Adayfi, who was a former detainee at Guantanamo Bay. And they have some pretty insane allegations here that are being leveled against Ron DeSantis himself, that he was essentially overseeing and helping to facilitate the torture of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. So they say, see no evil. And we start off with the interview here. They're just going to be going back and forth. So I'm just going to read this article in its entirety because as we progress through this, it gets progressively worse and worse for Ron DeSantis. So here to start us off directly from Mansour Adayfi, he says, as you know, Guantanamo was created out of the legal zone, out of the legal system. Torture was the mechanism of Guantanamo. Torture, abuse, and experimenting on prisoners. We went on a massive hunger strike in 2005, and there was force feeding. It was torture. He says, I saw a fucking handsome person come in, and he said, I'm here to ensure that you are treated humanely. That person was Ron DeSantis. Okay, so at the time, Ron DeSantis was working for the military in the capacity of a JAG lawyer, which is basically a lawyer who is specifically supposed to be advising military personnel on what is considered illegal, what is considered a war crime, what is considered torture, and all of that. So his job was to basically be a check on some of the illegal torture that was going on at Guantanamo Bay. But as you're going to see in this article, he was actually there doing the exact opposite of what his job was supposed to be, and essentially using some of the testimony, pretending as if he was going to go and help some of these prisoners, and using some of those statements from them in order to make their torture worse than it already was. Okay, so they continue. He says, yes, it was Ron DeSantis, and they said, quote, if you have any problems, if you have any concerns, just talk to me, said Ron DeSantis. And he says, we were drowning in that place, so I was like, oh, this is cool. This person will raise the concerns. But it was a piece of the game. What they were doing was looking for what hurts us more so that they could use it against us. In 2006, when DeSantis was there, it was one of the worst times at Guantanamo. The administration, the guards, all of them were the worst. They cracked down on us so hard. When they came to break our hunger strike, a team came to us. The head of the team, he was the general, he said, I have a job. I was sent here to break your fucking hunger strike. I don't care why you are here. I don't care who you are. My job is to make you eat. Today we are talking. Tomorrow there will be no talking. The second day, they brought piles of Ensure and they started force feeding us over and over again. Okay, force feeding, that's a war crime. That is illegal, okay? Can't be doing that. Not the best thing to be doing. But on top of that, I mean, again, this is just classic for Guantanamo Bay and many other like CIA black sites that the United States has been operating, especially during the War on Terror. You know, this is just like part of the game. This is part of standard operating procedures. So what we're going to get into here is very brutal and like honestly hard to read. But at the same time, you know, if this was happening in this one place to this one group of people, it was happening in a very much more widespread way. But they continue with Mike Preisner giving a little bit of clarification on what exactly Ensure is, saying that it's a thick, milky, nutritional shake mainly marketed on daytime television to elderly people, and it's very hard to drink. And he says, yes, and Ron DeSantis was there watching us. We were crying, screaming. We were tied to the feeding chair, and he was watching. He was laughing. Okay, like straight up psychopath behavior here from Ron DeSantis. Not unexpected. We've seen what, you know, other actions Ron DeSantis has been taking down in Florida, but this is like just straight up psychopath shit. I mean, you're looking at somebody who is being force-fed, who is trying to go on a hunger strike in order to protest against their already brutal conditions, and you are watching this all play out when it is your job to be a check on some of those illegal practices going on at this torture site, and instead you're sitting there and laughing along. I mean, it doesn't really get more sadistic than than this, but he says, our stomachs could not hold this amount of Ensure. They poured one can after another. So when he approached me, I said, this is the way we are treated. And he said, you should eat. And then I threw up in his face, literally on his face, in Ron DeSantis. Okay, so I mean, a little bit of a, retribution there, I guess, to the smallest degree you could possibly imagine. But Preisner then says it was well deserved. A JAG lawyer at the time, he would have been well aware this was a violation of international law. There is no question that it was torture. Yes, 100%. And then Adafi says, they used to restrain us in that feeding chair. They tied our head, our shoulders, our wrists, our thighs, and our legs. They put some kind of laxative in the feeding liquid. We were shitting ourselves all the time. I mean, this is just fucking brutal here, man. Then we were moved to solitary confinement, really cold cells. It was like 5 times a day. It wasn't feeding, it was just torture. 5 times a day. You can't possibly handle it. They just kept pouring the Ensure. In 1 week, they broke all of the hunger strikers, and he was there. All of them were watching. They also used to beat us, and if we screamed or were bleeding out of our nose or mouth, they were like, eat. That was the only word that they told us, eat. We were beaten all day long. Whatever you were doing, they just beat you. Pepper spray, beating, sleep deprivation. I mean, just really tacking up all of the different violations of the Geneva Convention that you could possibly ask for here. And he says that continued for 3 months. And he was there, Ron DeSantis. He was one of the people that supervised the torture, the abuses, the beatings, all the time at Guantanamo. And Preisner says, so Ron DeSantis was actually supervising torture, beatings. He was supervising these forced feedings. And he says, I'm telling Americans this guy is a torturer. He is a criminal. He was laughing, and he was there to ensure that we were treated humanely. I mean, this is the type of shit where if we were actually living in a functioning, democratic society with any degree of accountability, that this guy, Ron DeSantis, would be behind jail bars, okay, for this type of behavior. You were there specifically in a legal capacity, again, to be a check on this type of action, and you were sitting there laughing, watching all along the way, and then helping to facilitate the even worse treatment or mistreatment and torture of these prisoners, okay? This is the type of shit where you should be behind bars, not getting to run for president one day to become the most powerful person in the country, the most powerful person in the world. I mean, this is who Ron DeSantis is. I mean, again, on top of all of the other just grotesque things that we have been seeing coming out of the state of Florida under his watch, now we have this as just a, part of his history, and it's kind of bizarre that, like, nobody else is talking about this. I mean, this is not a national story that one of the lead guys, the guy who's being portrayed as like, oh, I'm going to be the, more reasonable and tamed version of Donald Trump, that this guy was actually straight up facilitating torture of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and this is not a nationwide wall-to-wall coverage breaking story. I mean, it tells you a lot about our media as well, because believe it or not, Ron DeSantis is not the only person. I mean, if these allegations are true, Ron DeSantis is not the only person who was responsible for facilitating this torture. I mean, obviously you have the people on the ground actually doing the torturing, right? But then you also have all the way up the chain, the military commanders, the officers, the president at the time, George W. Bush. I mean, one of the worst war criminals of all time. They should all be behind closed bars and or behind jail bars. But one other thing I want to say about this, there was actually another story that came out recently from the Pentagon chief Lloyd Austin, who was essentially coming out and saying that he didn't want to recommend criminal charges at the International Criminal Court, the ICC, for Russian war crimes in the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. And the justification for why he did not want to pursue that accountability at the International Criminal Court is because it would set the precedent for Americans to then also be charged at the International Criminal Court for our war crimes. Okay, so again, it's like our establishment class, the military-industrial complex, the political leaders within these top key positions, they're basically just straight up war crime at this point. I mean, there's no other, reasonable interpretation of what is actually going on here, with a complete lack of legality, a lack of humanity, a lack of accountability for these types of things. But they continue with Preisner saying that he was laughing, and he says, yes, they were looking at us, laughing because we were shitting ourselves. I was screaming and yelling. When your stomach is full of Ensure, you can't breathe, and you are throwing up at the same time. I was screaming. I looked at him, and he was actually smiling like someone who was enjoying it. Okay, I mean, just a demented motherfucker here, Ron DeSantis. He says one of the things that hurt us was, when somebody comes and tells you, I'm here to help you, I'm here to ensure that you are treated humanely, and when he turned against us, not turned against us, but showed his true face, it was a shock to us all. He had his notebook, he would ask the prisoners, do you have any problems? How can I help you? How have the guards treated you? And I was like, wow, thanks, but everything we told him was turned against us. And Preisner says, so basically, he was gathering intelligence to tell the interrogators what it was that was impacting you the most so that they could then do it more. And he says, I remember when we were talking about the noise at night, we were talking about the vacuums, the generators, the fans, and everything, and then they brought more stuff. And he says, you told Ron DeSantis, and then they increased the noise. And he says, they increased the noise, and also the food, for example. We told him we don't eat meat. What the guards did after that is they mixed all the food with meat. Okay, this is not even like under the fake bullshit guise that we have used during the war on terror to justify torture proceedings from, the Bush administration officials, calling this like enhanced interrogation and trying to pretend as if this is somehow, an effective procedure in terms of getting more information out of certain people or, something like that, which first of all is not even true. These torture methods are not even effective in any way whatsoever, because what ends up happening if you're torturing somebody to this degree is they'll just end up telling you anything that you want to hear in order for you to stop the fucking torturing. Okay, so number one, it's not even effective under their own bullshit justifications, but then you add on shit like this, like mixing all of the food with meat when they're telling you that as a matter of principle they do not consume meat. I mean, that's just sadistic. You're just doing that because you enjoy inflicting this type of pain and psychological torment on other human beings. I mean, it's that simple at this point. But they finish off here saying that, and that's another thing that you told DeSantis about the meat, and he says it's not just that, medicine, clothing, treatment, sleeping, the desecration of the Quran, everything. We talked to him when they were force feeding us, he was smiling, looking at us as trash. He says, you told me that there was a resistance tactic there of splashing the administrators, splashing them with your own feces, but you didn't use that tactic often, and he says only the worst people got splashed, and he says DeSantis, and he says yes. Okay, so in other words, according to this testimony here from somebody who was actually detained at Guantanamo Bay, who had to go through these types of, torture methods, right? He's saying DeSantis was not only there, he not only saw this stuff, he not only failed to do his job in his legal capacity that he was supposed to be there, but that he was there, enabling it, making it worse for them, and also enjoying it as it was going on, okay? As he describes him, the worst of the worst, okay? A guy who I think accurately he portrays here, who only deserves to be having feces thrown in his face. I mean, literally, that's the interpretation that I get from this. Now, of course, we've had some responses here from the upper echelon within the military establishment in this country. We have one take here from his former supervisor, the retired Navy Captain Patrick McCarthy, who was defending the governor, explaining that he was tasked with detainees when there were any complaints to ensure that they were lawfully addressed. And he says DeSantis served honorably and professionally in a very complex mission. Okay, very complex like what? You were torturing people who were being illegally detained at this extrajudicial, Guantanamo Bay torture facility, who were being detained there for years and years and years on end without even a moderate semblance of a fair trial or legal proceedings to determine whether or not they even, were the people you were looking for or had the connections you thought that they did. I mean, all of this is just completely insane, and it is a perfect encapsulation of, number one, how the military-industrial complex works, how the U.S. military works overseas and domestically here abroad and within our own backyard, but also who Ron DeSantis is as a person. Okay, so there you have it. We have this reporting that's been coming out. I mean, I know that, again, this was a podcast that came out a while ago, but it seems like hopefully at least we have some mainstream sources that are starting to pick this up. But this needs to be a way bigger story, because this is something that, again, is not only disqualifying for the office of the presidency, which, again, don't get me wrong, basically every single president, in recent American history has been a war criminal to one degree or another. But this takes it to an entirely different level on top of that, right? I mean, we've had presidents who have facilitated torture and all of that. We know the programs under the Bush administration, Obama, and all of that. But this guy, DeSantis, I mean, he was literally like there in the room and smiling and laughing as it was happening. Okay, so this guy is just the epitome of one of the most sadistic, evil motherfuckers that you could possibly imagine.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, Everyone is saying